Today we're looking at the conquest and the colonization of the Americas. But we're going to start by looking at the Iberian Peninsula because a lot of the characteristics and traits of the Iberian Peninsula are going to be brought over to the Americas. So when we look at life on the Iberian Peninsula, first off, they had just finished the Reconquista. In fact, the same year Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, that's the same year that Spain finally drove the last of the Muslim kingdoms out of Spain. And so, with that, now the Iberian Peninsula was all Christian. And now that they had retaken all of the Iberian Peninsula, they were ready to expand outward. And so, when we look at life on the Iberian Peninsula, it was a fairly urban society. And around all these urban areas were small villages and towns, and that's where most of your peasants lived, and that's where your agriculture was produced. But your upper classes tended to live in the towns and the cities, and they didn't do any manual labor. And so when they come over to the Americas, they're going to bring that with them, that lifestyle, and try to recreate this same lifestyle from the Iberian Peninsula over in the Americas. Before they reached the Americas, though, they began by rediscovering some islands in the Atlantic. And these islands become almost like a microcosm for what's going to happen on a much larger scale over in the Americas. They move into these islands like the Canaries, they take over the islands, they enslave the natives and use those as a labor source on large sugar plantations. But then, as the natives die off on these islands, due to Afro-Eurasian diseases, well, then they began to import slaves to work on these plantations. And most of those slaves are going to be brought from Africa. And so the same thing that happens on these islands is going to happen on a much larger scale over in the Americas. And so we're going to start with the conquest of the Caribbean. And it all begins with Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, of course, lands in the Bahamas in 1492, goes back, and this helps kind of open the door to more Europeans coming to the Americas. And once they got there, they had to find a way to make it profitable. And so the way to make it profitable was to set up sugar plantations and also silver mining. That was the two main ways that they found to make profits over in the Americas. And so they set up these encomiendas. And the encomienda system basically granted large sections of land to Spanish nobles who came over here. And then any natives on that land, they could use as they wanted. And so they could use them as laborers. They were also allowed to tax them. And that's how they encouraged Spanish to come and settle in the Caribbean. And so as a result of this, we're going to see a huge decline in the native populations of the Caribbean peoples, partially due to the abuses by the Spanish overseers, but also mostly due to diseases. Smallpox and measles are going to devastate native populations. The native population of the Caribbean peoples stood at about 4 million just before the arrival of the Europeans. And we're talking about the Taino peoples and the Carib peoples. That number is going to drop down to only a few thousand by 1540, and that was mostly due to the spread of these diseases. Shifting over to what we now call Latin America, we're going to see two main kind of areas, one in Mexico and another along the Andes Mountains in the old Inca Empire. And these are going to become kind of the two main centers for Spanish conquest in what we now call Latin America. And so this age of conquest starts in 1492 with Columbus, and it's going to continue until about 1570. And this wasn't well-organized conquest that was overseen by the Spanish government. These were kind of haphazard expeditions, and mostly led by single men and a small kind of makeshift army. And their main goal was to seek wealth. And so most of these expeditions only had between 50 and 500 or so men. And this age of the conquistadors, this age of conquest, is going to continue until about 1570 or so. So one of our first big conquistadors, successful conquistadors, was Hernan Cortez. And Hernan Cortez is able to, with a very small number of men, only about 450 to 600 or so men, is able to conquer the Aztec Empire. Now, he was greatly aided by disease, which wiped out large numbers of Aztec population. He was also aided by native allies. There were many groups of natives already in the Americas that didn't like the Aztecs. And so he used that to his advantage and used them to help conquer the Aztecs. But with a very small number of Europeans, he's able to conquer the Aztecs. And they're going to take the capital and build a new Spanish capital that would become Mexico City right over the old Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Very similarly, Francisco Pizarro is able to defeat the Inca in South America. Francisco Pizarro is going to take a very small number of soldiers, about 180 soldiers. Later, that number was reinforced up to about 600, but he's able to take over the entire Inca Empire. Now, again, he was aided by native allies. Also, when he arrives, the Inca were basically in the midst of a civil war. And so that had already weakened the Inca Empire. But he's going to conquer the Inca and then loot them of all their gold and silver. And so when we look at reasons for the collapse of these great empires that once stood in the Americas, it was mostly due to European diseases. Smallpox and measles and influenza decimated the native populations. Also, internal weaknesses, conflict, civil wars had already weakened these once great empires. And then lastly, the natives were unable to overcome superior European technology. Mostly we're talking about horses, which gave the Europeans a key advantage, guns, and also iron weapons.